What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking. This is the highly anticipated and long-awaited discography ranking of American progressive metal legends, Dream Theater. Yes, this was one that was a long time coming, considering, I'm a big fan of prog metal, and I figured, well, if I'm going to be ranking a prog metal band, why not go to the biggest one of them all in Dream Theater? So, yeah, this was definitely a challenge, going through all 15 studio albums, and to rank them, it was very, very challenging, considering, apart from one, maybe two albums, they're the definition of consistency when it comes down to prog metal as a whole. Now, as far as when and how I got into Dream Theater, well, kind of an interesting way that I first heard Dream Theater. I first heard of Dream Theater back in 2008, so I was about 14 at the time, and I first heard the song Pull Me Under, courtesy of Guitar Hero World Tour, the video game, and that song was in the game, and I listened to it as I was playing, and I was like, wow, this is some incredible stuff. And then over time, I gradually got into them, but I didn't really give the entire discography a shot until doing this ranking. But I did already have quite a few albums in the catalog. Like, I had Images and Words, and even the Astonishing at one point, and still do have it. But yeah, I eventually got almost all of the albums. I am missing one as of the recording of this video, which is Systematic Chaos, but I have it ordered, so it should be here anytime. But yeah, it was very enjoyable, even though it was long. Like, holy crap, this was probably, in my opinion, the longest discography I've gone through in terms of album length, because, man, it was pushing me really hard, but it was worth it in the end. So that's how I got into Dream Theater in the beginning, was through Guitar Hero, and then just gradually listening to other songs, and then eventually checked out the last three albums as they came out, so here we are doing the ranking. But without further ado, why don't we get started with the history of Dream Theater? So the story of Dream Theater begins with two very close friends, John Petrucci and John Mayung, who were close friends growing up, both from Long Island, New York, and were already becoming huge fans of hard rock and heavy metal and progressive rock. Like, some of their big influences early on when they were listening to music together was Rush, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Yes, Judas Priest. So you kind of get the feeling of what they want to do if they became musicians, was kind of morphing those kind of bands into their sound for the most part. So once we get to 1985, both the Johns, Petrucci and Mayung, decided to, after high school, go up to Boston, Massachusetts, to the Berklee College of Music to hone their craft as musicians, because they were already just starting to play guitar and bass respectively, but they wanted to hone their chops and really dive into composition. While a couple weeks into their semester at Berklee, they met one Mike Portnoy, who turns out was also from Long Island, New York, and was already there at Berklee around the same time as both the Johns, and they met up and became very fast friends immediately, because Portnoy was into pretty much the same bands as Petrucci and Mayung, but was also into thrash metal at the time, and eventually introduced the Johns into bands like Metallica and Megadeth, for example. And those kind of bands really latched on to the Johns, so they decided to mix what they already loved with what they heard courtesy of Mike. And the three of them together would start jamming in their practice room at Berklee, and yeah, like all the other rooms at Berklee, you would hear like either classical or jazz, and coming out of their room was basically Iron Maiden, Rush, and Metallica, pretty much the entire time they were there at Berklee. But after almost through the first semester of sorts, they decided, well, we're not going to stay for the entire time here at Berklee, so let's just go ahead and get a band going. So all three of them, and eventually would ask John Petrucci's close childhood friend Kevin Moore, who was a keyboardist, if he wanted to join their band, and together, along with vocalist Chris Collins, would form Majesty in 1985. So, and they got the name because they were waiting for tickets for a Rush show that they were doing. I think it was during the Power Windows era, so they were waiting to get Rush tickets, and somebody heard them play Bastille Day and told them, you should use the name Majesty for your band. And they went with it, and they started playing like local clubs and stuff like that early on, but it was pretty clear early on that Chris wasn't the right fit for the band when it came down to the vocals, so eventually he was fired, and they would eventually pick up veteran rocker Charlie Dominici to take over on vocals. And yeah, it was an interesting pairing, I will admit. So then around 1988, they were in the studio, actually, as they actually got a record deal with Mechanic Records, an independent label here in the States, and they got to go into the studio and work with the legendary Terry Date as their producer, and released March 6th, 1989, we would get When Dreamin' Day Unite. Now, it's important to note that right around the time that the album was about to be finished, they found out they couldn't use the name Majesty, so they were trying to figure out a new name, and Mike's father told Mike, how about Dream Theater, because that was the name of a movie theater that Mike's father worked out of. So they changed the name to Dream Theater, and then When Dream and Day Unite is released. Now, this is a very interesting album in the catalog. I actually have it towards the bottom. I have it as my number 14. It's definitely kind of humble beginnings for them, as while it's very progressive, it's not quite who Dream Theater were, or would become, I should say. And also, while Terry Date's the producer, I gotta admit, it doesn't quite sound like a Terry Date production, and I could imagine that around the same time he was already working with Overkill and Soundgarden at this point. So you would have thought, given Terry Date's laundry list of stuff he did in the late 80s and then through the rest of his career, you would have thought this album would have sounded amazing. That wasn't necessarily the case. Like the drum, like particularly the snare, sounded really thin, and it's not as heavy as they would become. But, and then, of course, the main thing that I think holds this album back is Charlie Dominici. He's not a bad vocalist. In fact, he's got a great voice, but it just didn't gel with what the rest of the band was going for. So his voice just never really quite fit the music that the Johns and Mike and Kevin were coming up with. But there are still some good songs on here, like A Fortune in Lies in particular. That song's got a lot of Iron Maiden and thrashy gallops to it, and I also love the Hammond organ in that song. And then the Yitz Jam, which is essentially Majesty backwards, kind of got a bit of a doomy intro, and then it's kind of like this big jam, and everybody gets a solo. Keyboards, guitars, bass. So it was like everybody got the shine. Drum solo, like everybody got the shine instrumentally on this track. And then The Killing Hand actually has some like folky acoustics and like twangy dissonant melodies and groove to it. But those are really the only main songs that stood out to me. And then songs like Status Seeker kind of had like an AM radio kind of vibe to it. It just didn't quite fit. So yeah, kind of humble beginnings. It's not a bad album. It's decent, but they would obviously get better after this album. So yeah, that's why I ranked as my number 14. So we fast forward a little bit in time, and they're touring a little bit. They didn't get to do a whole lot of touring on When Dreamin' Day Unite because Mechanic Records kind of made a bunch of empty promises about a video and doing big tours and stuff, and that didn't happen. So This was like the first of two major creative frustrating periods for Dream Theater, but the guys kept writing, even though eventually Charlie Dominici would be let go from the band sometime in 1991. So out goes Charlie, and they were already, the Johns, Kevin, and Mike, were already writing songs for the next album, but they were struggling to find a new vocalist. Then they heard a tape from a band called Winter Rose, where one James Labrie would be heard off of that demo, and they decided to listen to this demo, and they were like, wow, he's got a great voice, we should fly him out. And they see the pictures of him and they think, oh my god, he's got the look we're looking after, he's a good looking guy. And they're thinking he must be an asshole, but they fly James out and he's a great guy. So they pretty much gelled right away, and James would become the vocalist for the rest of the history of the band. So welcome in the mighty James Labrie. So once James Labrie got on board, then they started getting together all of the lyrics and everything together for this next album, and then they would go into the studio at the end of 91, going into 1992. This time they went to Atco Records. They had to buy their way out of the Mechanic record deal, which took a little bit of money, but it was well worth it in the end to get out of that deal. And they went to Atco Records, and they would get producer David Prater to help out on this album, and released July 7th, 1992 on Atco Records, we get Images and Words. This is my number 3 album. I know some people might be shocked this isn't number 1. It was close, but going into the ranking and then coming out of it, it did drop a couple spots for me to number 3, but it's still a genre-defining album for progressive metal. Like, this is really where Dream Theater becomes Dream Theater. The songs are much heavier, more defined, and the production's fantastic. And, of course, the song Pull Me Under is still the biggest hit that the band has had or ever will have. And it's a fantastic song. You got thrashy riffs and rhythms, great melodies, an awesome breakdown, and phenomenal leads. Then again, you will never hear me complain about John Petrucci's riffs or lead work. The guy is a fucking guitar wizard, to put it in a better term. But yeah, but what was interesting, when that song blew up, this was still during the grunge invasion from Seattle. Like, 92, grunge was the big flavor of the month. And out of nowhere, this little progressive metal band from New York that started in Boston explode out of nowhere with that song, Pull Me Under, and then the album itself took off, like, up to the fucking stratosphere. But it's not just Pull Me Under that makes this album. You have other phenomenal songs on here, like Take the Time, which is, like, great prog rock, but it does have some, like, heavy chugs and gallops. Metropolis Part 1, The Miracle and the Sleeper, it was their first real epic song, and it has everything that Dream Theater is all about, and everyone got to shine. Under a Glass Moon, it's soaring but yet chaotic. Learning to Live, which was the longest track of the album, it's got tasty melodies, acoustics that feel folky but chunky riffs on top. And then even the other 3 tracks, Another Day, Surrounded, and Wait for Sleep, are all really beautiful songs. With Surrounded in itself kind of reminded me of Asia a little bit, like as if this was like a modernized Asia song. But yeah, this album definitely propelled Dream Theater into the mainstream for the most part, and remain a juggernaut of prog metal to this day. But the album itself is my number 3. So, safe to say, after Images and Words came out, and after Pull Me Under was released to the radio, and that music video with even James wearing a Napalm Death shirt, which was really, really cool, they got to do big tours off of Images and Words, which was something that the band didn't think would happen when they were still under Mechanic Records because of the management behind the label. But they got to play all around the world, and it was like the big dream come true for them. However, they wouldn't be on ADCO for very long. In fact, ADCO would then, I think, become East West, but also for this next album, it would be co-released with Atlantic Records. So they would return to the studio in 1994, this time with co-producers John Purtle and Dwayne Barron helping out on the production, and released October 4th, 1994, we get Awake. This is my number one album. Holy shit, this album I think is the GOAT of Dream Theater albums, because it is basically everything Dream Theater was and are to this day wrapped up into one album. It's much heavier. It's one of the heaviest Dream Theater albums of all time, and it's more ambitious. Like, the big thing that makes this heavier, 7-string guitars started in this album, and they did this before Korn did it. So you can thank Dream Theater, as well as even a band like Fear Factory to a lesser extent, for 7-string guitars becoming very prominent in metal. And also, this album was so influential, it would influence Death for their album Symbolic in terms of songwriting and composition and all that. Also, there's slightly more technical songwriting on this album, but still remains very catchy. Like the opening track, 6 O'Clock, one of my personal favorite Dream Theater songs. It's like so fun with smooth drum work, and I love the organs on that song and the riff arrangements. Innocence Faded, definitely a lot closer to their more prog rock side. And James's vocals, say what you will about James LaBrie now, but you have to admit at one point he had some of the best vocals in metal at this point. Like, they were soaring but not cheesy. And then Erotomania, one of my favorite instrumentals that Dream Theater ever did. And then, of course, you get into the song Voices, which, again, feels closer to prog rock, but with more melody, some great atmosphere, even a little dissonant melody. And then, probably my favorite mellow song Dream Theater ever did, The Silent Man. It is beautiful, it's mellow, it's gorgeous. And then the final two big standouts for me, The Mirror, which feature maybe the heaviest riffs on the entire album, and even some like triplet chugs show up in there. And then Lie, which was the big single of the album, but it's got crunchy guitars, a nice breakdown, and shreddy leads. What more could you want out of a Dream Theater album than what was on Awake? And that's why this album is my number one. Now, not too long after Awake came out, original keyboardist Kevin Moore would end up leaving the band, citing disinterest in Dream Theater as a whole. So he left, and they were going through a few different keyboardists before they would eventually pick up Derek Sherinian, who prior to joining Dream Theater already did stuff with Kiss and Alice Cooper. So he already had some big road exposure, and they decided to pick him up. Granted, there was a bit of a concern considering he had short hair and everybody else still had really long hair, and this was right before short hair became back in fashion. But they said that Derek played his ass off on the Awake tour, and they loved him so much and that he's a great guy, they kept him in the band for a while. And then 1995, they do the legendary A Change of Seasons EP, which I didn't include in the ranking, but if I did, that would probably be top 5 if you ask me, because that whole song is a masterpiece. However, after A Change of Seasons and doing more touring and such, there began to be some more creative frustrations coming up, because they were still on East West. However, East West were starting to kind of hound the band to write stuff that was more radio friendly, considering Pull Me Under was still popular, and while Awake did very well, not to the level that the label thought it would do. So they kind of pressured Dream Theater to kind of write some more radio friendly songs, and they would return to the studio in 1997. This would begin their long relationship with one Kevin Shirley, who would eventually go on to produce all of Iron Maiden's albums from like 2000 onward. But they would start working with Kevin Shirley, And released September 19th, 1997, we get Falling into Infinity. This one ended up falling in the ranking for me. I originally had this a little bit higher, but it wound up as my number 12 album. Yeah, it's kind of an odd album for a lot of fans, considering, there was creative conflicts at this point, and the label was kind of pressuring them to go into this more radio-friendly kind of direction. But there's still some gems on this entire album. Like, hell, I would say arguably it's the most underrated Dream Theater album. Like, top to bottom, it's not bad. It's still a pretty damn good album. It's just, in comparison to most of the other albums, it just doesn't quite hold up. And plus, you can definitely tell they were going for that more radio-friendly sound due to the pressures of the label. But you still have some pretty cool songs on here, like gorgeous leads in Hell's Kitchen. Although Just Let Me Breathe, while it's heavy, it's kind of a dumb song. But the big standouts, Trial of Tears, which has some like prog rock and 80s prog elements going on. Lines in the Sand, which features Doug Pennick from King's X, has some gallops and rocking riffs to it. Hollow Years, I should say, a much softer song, but it is pretty. Burning My Soul, great like Metallica and Deep Purple influences on here. But the big standout is Peruvian Skies. That song, you can definitely hear Metallica in the riffs and the acoustics on that song, and it just goes to show you how much Dream Theater loves Metallica. You will still get Metallica riffs in Dream Theater albums to this day. And Peruvian Skies was definitely like one of those where it's like, yeah, these guys really love old Metallica, and they showcase that in a great way. But yeah, the album, less heavy, more melodic. It's kind of odd, but it is underrated. I do think it's a pretty good album for what they were doing. However, in comparison to most of the other catalogs, my number 12. So, safe to say, after Falling into Infinity, the band was kind of at a crisis point. And this was the second big dark period in the band after When Day and Dream Unite, or Dream and Day Unite. I always get them flipped. But as Mike Portnoy said, this was the second big crisis point in the band's history, and they thought, if labels are just going to keep telling us what to do, I'm not for it. He said he got into playing music to play music, not to be corporate or anything else. So they were shopping around for different labels, and they eventually got picked up by Elektra Records, and thankfully Elektra allowed them to have creative freedom with everything they did, and this would be the beginning of the band producing the albums themselves. John Petrucci and Mike Portnoy would produce pretty much the rest of the albums up until Portnoy would leave, and Petrucci would take over as sole producer from this day forward. Now, for this next album, Petrucci and Portnoy would get some help, mixing help from both Kevin Shirley, but also David Bottrell, who up to this point was pretty well known for his work with Tool. So, yeah, and also fans were clamoring for a sequel to the song Metropolis Part 1 back on Images and Words, but they never got around to it until this next album. Now, also after the tour for Falling into Infinity in early 1999, Derek Shrinian would be let go from the band, and then they would pick up their keyboardist through to where we are now, Jordan Rudess, who they actually approached to replace Kevin Moore back in '94. However, Jordan was a little bit busy with other projects, and also he would eventually work with Portnoy and Petrucci on Liquid Tension experiments, so they already were very close with him. And then once Derek was gone, they're like, okay, now the time is right to get Jordan into the band. And Jordan Rudess would come in as the permanent keyboardist from here on out. And for this next album, they decided to finally listen to the fans and give them the sequel to Metropolis Part 1, and do a whole story about a man named Nicholas who goes through past life regression therapy, goes through loss and dark times, and finally released October 26th, 1999, we get Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. This is my number 2 album. Holy shit, this album is a masterpiece of progressive music as a whole. This is a masterpiece, and it definitely has more leaning towards prog rock, but it's still really heavy at a lot of points and times on this album. And I love how they arranged everything, like the opening little ditty that leads into Overture 1928, which that song itself has some heavy chugs and kind of feels like Opeth a little bit before it just turns into this big epic journey. For Fatal Tragedy, it's heavy and dark, and you still get your thrashy riffs and gallops. Beyond This Life, kind of almost everything. It's thrashy, it's atmospheric, there's some awesome swings, quite whimsical, which is going to be a word you're going to hear me use a lot in Dream Theater songs, is whimsical, and Triplet Chugs. Through Her Eyes, beautiful song. The song Home actually has some like Middle Eastern flair, like the sitar comes up, but you do get some like heavy riffs and bass that kind of remind me of Tool. The Dance of Eternity, which is like, some people will say is like the most complex Dream Theater song on guitar because Petrucci's flying everywhere and there's so many changes. The Spirit Carries On, probably one of the best prog rock ballads I have ever heard in my life. And then Finally Free, perfect closer to what I would say is a perfect prog metal, prog rock album. Nothing more, nothing less to be said. This album is a masterpiece. Though it falls behind Awake because it wasn't as heavy as Awake, and also I just like Awake a little bit more. But this is like almost like 1A, 1B. This album is brilliant. Number 2. And with that said, I need a fucking drink. Now, they would be touring quite a bit off of Metropolis Part 2 and got to do some really big tours. I can't go into like who they played with and all that, but they just pretty much, that's the whole thing from here on out. It's like write, record, tour, pretty much throughout the remainder of this discography. However, they would finally get back to the studio in 2001 to work on a rather ambitious album, their first double disc album, where both discs would be very different. Disc 1 would be mostly a collection of songs. Disc 2 would be one song, but split into parts. And influences for them at this point, they were really inspired by Metallica, Megadeth, Alice in Chains, Nine Inch Nails, Pantera, Soundgarden, and Tool. And then finally released January 29th, 2002, we get 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. This is my number 5. I think this was a very good follow-up to Metropolis Part 2, but they figured, okay, there's no point in trying to replicate Metropolis Part 2 and do a Part 3. It would just be impossible to follow. So they decided to do something different, do a double disc that went a little over an hour and a half long, combined both discs. But both discs have some awesome stuff to it. The opening on disc 1, The Glass Prison, which has a lot of Megadeth and Metallica riffs laced throughout. And also this would be the first of 5 songs going forward on the next several albums where it's all about Mike Portnoy's 12-step program from Alcoholics Anonymous when he got sober in 2000. So this was the first of 5 songs in a series. And it was a phenomenal track to start things off. Blind Faith has a more subdued atmosphere, and it's definitely more prog rock lenient, but I still thought it was a fantastic track. Misunderstood, you get some like almost grungy moments. Like that's really where kind of like the Soundgarden and Alice in Chains influence kind of comes in with some great clean guitars. The Great Debate, thrashy riffs and Triplet Chugs, maybe one of the heavier songs across the board. And then the entire second disc of the title track, every part, it's bombastic, whimsical, you get some really beautiful soft moments, you get some thrashy moments, it gets dark and heavy, and that almost felt like a little precursor to what we would get next. Like they were maybe teasing the next album with the closing bits of the title track on here. But yeah, another fantastic album, my number 5. Now, as they would go on to tour on 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, the fans, the big time Dream Theater fans, were really all in on their heavier songs. Like, those were the songs that I think got the biggest response from their fans. And when Dream Theater saw that response, they thought, what if we did an album where it's all heavy and it's dark, brooding? Let's just go for less majesty and more darkness. So they would go back to the studio in 2003. Once again, it's like I said, it's Petrucci and Portnoy producing, Kevin Shirley mixing, and released November 11th, 2003. We would get Train of Thought. This is my number 4 album. Definitely the heaviest Dream Theater album so far up to this point. I would still say it's their heaviest. Like I said, it's basically a response to their fans' love of the heavier Dream Theater songs, and basically James LaBrie's like, you want the heaviest? We'll give you the heaviest. And pretty much every single song is amazing. As I Am, the opener, shortest track on the album, but it's one of my favorite Dream Theater songs. It's dark and it's very evil sounding, like arguably the most evil Dream Theater song. This Dying Soul, you get some like real cool like death metal double time stomps, but you do still get some like more progressive clean sections, big breakdowns, and even a riff that reminds me a lot of Metallica's Blackened. And this was also the second song in the Portnoy's 12-step program series. Endless Sacrifice, this was a big one, like somber acoustic guitars, chuggy heavy chorus, thrash riffs, whimsical again. Honor Thy Father, there's some chugs and, dare I say, almost like rapped vocals, which I thought was odd, but it was kind of cool. And then some like triplet chugs. Stream of Consciousness, how appropriate of a title considering it's another great instrumental, and it does feel like a big stream of consciousness musically. And then the closing track, In the Name of God, dark cleans, there's some like sinister doomy riffs on there, and more triplet chugs. Like whenever Dream Theater does do triplet chugs, they do them very damn well, I must admit. So yeah, top to bottom, definitely the heaviest Dream Theater album of all time, with Awake being a close second in terms of heaviness. But yeah, when they said they would deliver their heaviest album, they absolutely did that. I don't think they've touched this album in terms of heaviness. They may get close to that with their recent stuff, but that's mostly because, with modern production being the way it is. But yeah, Train of Thought, number 4. So as we continue on, they continue to play, write, record, tour, as always. Then they would get back to the studio at the very end of 2004 into 2005. And this time, this was basically all Petrucci and Portnoy doing everything when it comes down to the production. And for this album, they pretty much decided to go out there and write their probably most technical, wackiest album to date. Released June 7th, 2005, we would get Octavarium. This is my number 6 album. Holy shit, when I say it's wacky and technical, it is wacky and technical. Like, these songs are just all over the fucking place. Like, the opening track, The Root of All Evil, which is the 3rd song in the Portnoy 12-step program series. But man, there's some like awesome Metallica-inspired riffs again. These Walls, I love that more thick guitar tone that cuts through on that song, but you also do get some more beautiful, softer moments here and there on the track. And hell, one of the first Dream Theater songs I ever heard, Panic Attack, is on here, and it's, I would arguably say, one of, if not their most technically insane songs they've ever written. And it almost feels like it could have been a song cut from Train of Thought that they just latched on here, because in tone, sounds like it could have been on Train of Thought, like the guitar tuning being in C, and it was super heavy. Sacrificed Sons, somber epic, and of course there's some more, like, again, Metallica riffs showing up, and it's about those who died on 9/11. And then the final track, the title track, 20 plus minutes, I think it's about 25 minutes of everything Dream Theater, and it's just such a huge roller coaster ride. Even though I will say the one complaint about the song was the intro does kind of drag a little bit, but thankfully after the intro you get basically nothing but perfection after that. And then other tracks like The Answer Lies Within and I Walk Beside You, they're short but they're really pretty songs for their more prog rock fans. So yeah, in terms of like technicality and complexity, this might be their most technical and complex album to date, and it is my number 6. So, moving on from there, again, Right Record Tour the entire way through. They would return to the studio at the beginning of 2007, and this time they're at a new label. They're now on Roadrunner Records, and this time they would actually begin a long relationship with one Paul Northfield, who mostly did production work for Rush and Queensryche, so he would come in to help out with the mixing process while Petrucci and Portnoy continued to do the actual production. And released June 4th, so almost 2 years to the date of Octavarium, June 4th, 2007, we would get Systematic Chaos. This is my number 8. This is actually the one album, like I said at the beginning, that I was missing in the collection, and maybe by the time this video comes out, I'll have it in the shelf. But yeah, I didn't think much about this album for a long time, and then I listened to it, and I'm like, this is really damn good. Like, and it feels like musically like a hybrid between Images and Words and Awake. Like, you get your more hooky, catchy songs from Images and Words, but you also get the heaviness of Awake. Like the opening track, In the Presence of Enemies, it's split into 2 parts. Part 1 kind of feels like more cosmic, shreddy, melodic, and more of a rocker. Part 2 is a lot more moody. It's a little more suspenseful. There's some doom. There's some chug going on in part 2. Constant Motion, very thrashy tune, and even Portnoy doing some like thrashy vocals, which he's got a pretty solid thrash delivery, and I would have been curious to hear what he could do if he was a frontman of a band. The Dark Eternal Night, this one of the heavier songs on the album. It's chuggy, yet it's still got melody to it. It's thrashy. It's almost kind of like a circus sideshow at times with the feeling of it, and then it gallops, and it's got a rather mechanical kind of vibe to it. Then the big prog epic, the closing track, The Ministry of Lost Souls. Big prog epic with lots of doom and gloom and galloping rhythms and riffs. But for me, the big standout on here would be Repentance, which is the 4th part of the 12-step program series for Mike Portnoy. Unlike the previous 3 and then the final part on the next album, this one's moody, it's sullen, it's soft, it's melodic, and so many guest appearances. Hell, at one point, originally, Portnoy wanted to get James Hetfield, Bruce Dickinson, Dave Mustaine, and Jeff Tate to partake on this song. However, they all declined, most likely due to scheduling conflicts. So the guests we ended up with Corey Taylor, Michael Ockerfeld, Chris Jericho, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, David Ellison, Steven Wilson, Daniel Gidlenlow, I think I got it right that time, John Anderson, Neil Morse, and Steve Hogarth. So, all-star musicians from all over rock and metal, from death metal to thrash to prog, just all over the map. So it was really cool, and it was interesting how the final half of that song goes with all these guests talking about their experiences with trying to forgive themselves or others, or have others forgive them for stuff that happened in their pasts. So it was a very revealing song for a lot of people, and it's the big standout on the album for me. And yeah, Systematic Chaos, number 8. Now, once again, Ride Record Tour as we keep going throughout this entire catalog, and then eventually back to the studio we go in early 2009, and this would end up being the final album for Mike Portnoy. Released June 23rd, my mom's birthday. 2009, we get Black Clouds and Silver Linings. This is my number 7. I actually thought this was a little bit of a musical improvement on Systematic Chaos, even though it's not really by much, it's only one spot. So I think I like this album a little bit more because there's more stuff going on with this album. And they even stated, like, musically, it's like a hybrid of A Change of Seasons, Octavarium, Learning to Live, Pull Me Under in the Glass Prison, musically all wrapped into one. I will say, though, at times this album's drum sound is a little thin and maybe the guitars are a little too gainy. But songwriting-wise, this is some of the best stuff they've done during the 2000s era. A Nightmare to Remember, the opening track, it's a dark, moody piece, but it's got evil riffs, lumbering grooves, triplet chugs, almost like a death metal song, but done by Dream Theater. And no death growls. Excuse me. A Rite of Passage, it's another heavy, chuggy, riffy barn burner. The Shattered Fortress, it's the final song in the 12-step program series for Mike Portnoy, and it's another heavy one. The Best of Times starts off with some Opeth vibes, but then it turns into almost like a modern-day Rush song. And then the Count of Tuscany is another one of them, like, big, all-encompassing songs for Dream Theater, top to bottom. Like, it's everything you love about Dream Theater wrapped into one track, and they always manage to do that with, like, their longest song on an album. It feels like just the perfect all-encompassing Dream Theater song. So yeah, top to bottom, damn good stuff, even though the production has some issues, particularly with the drums sounding a little bit thin and the guitars a little bit gainy. I think if they would have fixed those issues, this actually could have gone up above Octavarium, but for now, it's my number 7. So as stated just a moment ago, Black Clouds and Silver Linings would end up being the final album with Mike Portnoy for a long time, because 2010 comes around and he was asked to fill in for the late great Rev from Avenged Sevenfold to finish up the drum recordings for the album Nightmare, and also got to do touring with Avenged Sevenfold for the Nightmare tour in the beginning in 2010. And eventually, after that tour was done, Mike would leave Avenged Sevenfold, and he had it in his head that perhaps with how busy Dream Theater got since the beginning, he thought, why don't we take a little bit of a break, because it's just been a steady Ride Record Tour process the entire time, and he suggested, why don't we take a year off and we can come back refreshed and we can really deliver something to the world. However, the rest of the guys didn't want to wait, so according to Mike, he said he either had to go unwillingly and start the next album or step aside. So he chose to step aside at the end of 2010. And with that, then the search began for a new drummer, which was going to be tough to follow Mike Portnoy's shoes, considering Portnoy is one of the 5 greatest metal drummers of all time. But they would eventually pick up former Annihilator drummer Mike Mangini, who was at one point a professor over at Berkeley. So Mike Mangini would come in to handle drum duties for the next several albums. And they would get back to the studio in 2011. And this would end up being the final album with Paul Northfield helping out with the mixing. And this would be the first album solely produced by John Petrucci. And released September 13th, 2011, we would get A Dramatic Turn of Events, which I have to think is a bit of a metaphor for Portnoy gone, Mangini in. There you have it. This album is my number 10. While it does fall in comparison to what we've heard thus far, it's still a really good album. Though again, this is becoming a common issue. The snare at times sounds thin on some of these songs, but the songs themselves are really good. The opening track, On the Backs of Angels, You get some, like, again, more like Megadeth and Metallica acoustic licks, but you still get lots of thrash elements, which definitely helps with having a thrash drummer in Mike Mike Mangini, due to his pedigree with being an Annihilator for a few albums. But it definitely does help add to the more heavy side of Dream Theater. Lost, Not Forgotten. This one brings back some of those Iron Maiden influences. Like, some of the Iron Maiden influences kind of waned after a little while. It was cool to see them bring the Maiden influence back with the gallops and twin harmonies and chugs. Bridges in the Sky, big bombastic beginning, but you get heavy riffs and triplet chugs once again. Outcry, one of the more groovier Dream Theater songs, and it's very, very riffy. And then Breaking All Illusions almost feels like if you took Rush, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest, mashed them together with the riffs, and then suddenly it turns sullen. It's kind of a strange song, but I kind of like it for that reason, because it's like Dream Theater is like, we're just going to keep throwing a bunch of curveballs at you and see if you can catch it. And for me, this one stuck. I actually thought this was maybe the best song on the album. I don't know, On the Backs of Angels was a damn good opener, and I really, really liked that song. But yeah, overall, really good stuff once again. Welcome, Mike Mangini. However, yeah, it does fall in comparison to other albums, and that's why it is my number 10. So, moving on from there, they would again write, record, tour up until they would return to the studio in 2013. This time we have Richard Chaisky, who did stuff with Rush, to come in to do the mixing for this next album. And most of the lyrics on this next album would be inspired by real life events such as the Boston Marathon bombings. And released September 24th, 2013, we would get the self-titled Dream Theater album. This one's my number 9. I actually think this was an improvement on A Dramatic Turn of Events in terms of songwriting and production. Granted, at times, like especially in the beginning of the album, still the drums sounded a little bit thin in the beginning, but as the album goes on, the drum sound gets better, or at least you get used to it. But yeah, tracks like The Enemy Inside, you get some like great gallops that feel like Rush and Iron Maiden mixed together. But dare I say, some power metal D-beats going on. The Looking Glass, I think, might be one of their catchiest songs ever, and it felt like a nice tribute to Rush. It almost felt like if they mixed Free Will and Limelight, mixed it together, and you got The Looking Glass. Enigma Machine, one of my favorite instrumentals that Dream Theater's ever done. It's thrashy, it's shreddy, feels like a perfect thrash metal instrumental track. The Bigger Picture, very heartfelt song, I must admit, with the melodies and even some of the heavy riffs that pop up. Weren't overtly heavy, but they were heavy enough to like really add an extra bite to the song, even though it's mostly like heartfelt and melodic. Surrender to Reason, some Opeth vibes again show up on that song. And then the closing track, Illumination Theory, which is 22 minutes, but man, is it epic and fun to listen to. Like, doomy riffs in the beginning, and then you get big triplet swings and chugs. It's got some great groove, it's whimsical again, and then there's even a big symphonic classical section, which this was really when the symphonic metal elements that were starting to pepper in before really kind of came through, which I know some people may not like that. I don't mind symphonic elements being in metal albums as long as it doesn't overpower the guitars. Thankfully, they didn't. In fact, they complement the guitars and the keyboards perfectly. And that classical section, because I like hearing like classical music and movie soundtracks, that's kind of what it felt like. So yeah, self-titled, my number 9. So, after doing more writing, recording, and stuff like that, they would return to the studio in 2015, and this time they wanted to do yet another double disc and a concept album all about a dystopian future. And, well, released January 29th, 2016, we would get the Astonishing. Or as I and a lot of other people call it, the Astonishing. Yeah, this is clear-cut dead last. And what's funny, I reviewed this album when it came out in 2016, and I initially really liked it in the beginning. It has not aged very well since then. Like, I've barely gone back to this album. In fact, it was a challenge. I actually, for the most part on this, because I was like, do I really need to? I ended up just kind of skimming through this album because, like, listening to it when it came out a couple times was crazy enough. But then going back and it's like, just too bloated. And it feels like a Disney metal album than anything else. And there's a bunch of these needless interludes that just take up too much space. Like, the first disc is 80 minutes. And disc 2 is about 50. If anything, disc 2, at least, they knew when to trim the fat. And what I will admit, the one big positive with this album, at least the drums sound fantastic on this album. And again, I don't think it's a horrible album. I don't think it's not good, but I don't think it's a horrible album. I definitely wouldn't put it among the 10 worst metal albums of all time. Like, fuck that. Top 30, perhaps, but not top 10. Like, I don't think it's horrible, but it's not good. Like, it was mostly moments within the songs that I like, oh, there are some cool riffs that show up on here, but it just gets suffocated by everything else. There are only 2 top-to-bottom songs that I even liked. Dystopian Overture, because it has, like, some doomy nods to it, and Heaven's Cove, because I like that Metallica inspiration on the riffs and the acoustic playing. But other than that, nah. If people still want to keep saying that Judas Priest Nostradamus is bad, then this is like Nostradamus times 20. So, yeah, I will just say it right there. Nostradamus is far better than this. I am dead serious when I say that. But yeah, not that great of an album. Not a horrible album, but not good. But it's easily my last place. So, moving on from there, and yeah, this album was maybe critically received, but by the fan base, it was not that well received. So, yeah, they decided to kind of buckle down and kind of get back on track a little bit. And they would enter the studio at the end of 2018, second half of 2018. Their deal with Roadrunner finished, and now they are on Inside Out Music, which is actually a progressive subsidiary of Century Media Records. So they're technically part of the Century Media family, which is really cool. So they're on Inside Out Music from here on out. And they would go back into the studio, and released January 22nd, 2019, we would get Distance Over Time. While this one's towards the bottom, it's my number 13, compared to the Astonishing, big bounce back. Huge bounce back. This is actually a pretty damn good album. You can definitely tell, feels a lot more modern. Like, they were starting to integrate some modern inspiration from perhaps bands like Between the Buried and Me, Periphery, Tesseract, Meshuggah, even though Meshuggah's an old school band. But you get the idea, like, more of the modern prog influence is starting to come in here, and definitely felt in the production. But the opening track, Untethered Angel, it's heavy, chuggy, speedy, one of the best songs of the more modern era of Dream Theater. But you also got some other cool ones like Fall Into the Light. You get heavy rocking riffs. Also some triplet swings, S2N, funky bass line, and technical guitars, although I had to laugh when I heard Owen Wilson's "wow" out of nowhere on the song. I'm like, wait a minute, did I just get poked on a app with the wow? No, it was in the song. And then At Wit's End, great, like, syncopation, melody, but there's also some cool somber moments. And then the closing track, Pale Blue Dot, some great gallops, it's bombastic, sultry lead work, which again, you will never hear me complain about Petrucci's guitar abilities. And yeah, and this was actually the second shortest, or might have been the shortest, Dream Theater album. Like, it's under an hour long, so it's like they decide, okay, let's trim the fat on a lot of these songs and just get right to it. And I think for the most part, they did a pretty good job on this. So a huge bounce back from the Astonishing. However, it's still near the bottom just because there were so many other albums I liked more. But yeah, my number 13. So they would return to the studio in late 2020, early 2021. So yeah, this was during the pandemic. And for this next album, they would actually get mixing help from the one and only Andy Sneap. John Petrucci producing, Andy Sneap mixing, and released October 22nd, 2021. We get their most recent album to date, A View from the Top of the World. I also reviewed this, same with Distance Over Time, but I also reviewed this when it came out. This one, while it's my number 11, it's only at number 11 just because it needs more time. But for the most part, this is some really good stuff. And, like, yeah, musically feels like a continuation of Distance Over Time, but it also feels like it's getting more proggy again. Like, it's less about the accessibility and more towards who they really are at their core. Also, 8-string guitars are introduced into their toolbox, particularly on the final two songs, Awaken the Master and the title track, which again, the title track being 20 plus minutes, it's an all-encompassing song. But the opening track, The Alien, again, more of those thrashy riffs and chugs that they like to integrate into their songs every once in a while. Sleeping Giants, it's a little more of a suspenseful piece, but it's got rocking riffs. Transcending Time, like a Rush-inspired rocker. So it's like, again, everything you know and love about Dream Theater, but improving on it in comparison to where we were the past couple of albums. And yeah, it's given some people some hope of seeing them continue going down this direction going forward with whatever they decide to do next. But yeah, my number 11. And, well, as of recording this, and yeah, View from the Top of the World, that would end up being the final album with Mike Mangini on drums, as at the very end of 2023, early 2024, it was announced Mike Portnoy is back in Dream Theater, which was huge praise considering while the albums with Mangini, apart from the Astonishing, weren't bad, definitely felt like the songwriting was missing a little bit without Portnoy. Now that Portnoy's back into the fold, helping out with songwriting, and as of recording, they are currently in the studio working on their 16th album. And in fact, from what I saw, they're pretty damn close to finishing it. Like, they got most of the instruments recorded. I believe right now they're in the process of mixing it. So maybe November we'll be getting new Dream Theater, and I can't wait, because I look forward to hearing what Portnoy has to bring to the table now. But yeah, that does it for the Dream Theater discography. Like I said, this was challenging and long to go through, but hey, finally got through it, and I'm so happy because Dream Theater, one of the kings, arguably the kings of prog metal, even though for me that would be Opeth, but Dream Theater in terms of like more of the more well-known bands, the kings of the genre. And I salute to the Theater of Dreams. But that will do it for this, and in fact, the next discography, it's going to be a little while. Halloween will be coming up pretty soon, and around Halloween time, I'm going to be talking Merciful Fate. I can't wait to do that one because we're finally going to get to talk King Diamond on here, and it's going to be a fun ride to go through all of those albums. But of course, let me know in the comments, how would you rank the Dream Theater discography? What's your favorite and least favorite Dream Theater albums? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.
Thank you for your patronage.